I was diagnosed with cancer on April Fool's Day, 2015. Prior to that, the only really clear memory I had of an April Fool's Day came around April 1st, 1990-ish. I was in third or fourth grade, and I had decided that my dad would make the perfect victim of an April Fool's prank. Now, I say that because I knew his daily routine really well. See, in my hometown, the fire whistle blew every evening at 6 o'clock, signifying the close of the workday. So when the whistle blew, my dad would lock up the store. He'd drive a couple blocks home to our house and walk in the front door. He'd go directly to his bedroom where he would put his wallet and his keys in the top drawer of his nightstand. And I had decided a really great April Fool's prank would be to surprise him with a burst of confetti when he walked into his bedroom. After school that afternoon, I raced home and rounded up all of the brightly colored wrapping paper and construction paper and tissue paper I could find. And I sat down in front of reruns of The Brady Bunch and Saved by the Bell, and I tore that brightly colored paper into a brightly colored mountain of confetti. And when I heard the 6 o'clock whistle blow, I raced out into the kitchen to find a container big enough to hold this mountain of confetti I had just created. And in my haste, I grabbed a heavy metal bucket that my mom kept under the kitchen sink. And I scooped the confetti into that heavy metal bucket, and I propped it on the edge of my parents' bedroom door. And then I hid behind the sofa, just waiting for my dad to get home and be surprised by this burst of confetti. All I really remember about what happened next was the sound of my dad hollering as that heavy metal bucket fell out of the clear blue sky and hit him in the back of the head. And that is sort of how I felt on that April Fool's Day about 25 years later when my doctor said, "Nick, you have cancer." I had thyroid cancer, which I had not heard of prior to my diagnosis. But over the next couple of days and weeks, lots of well-meaning people approached me to say, "I am so sorry to hear about your diagnosis, but I heard thyroid cancer was a good one." Listen, I hate onions. I don't want onions on a burger or on a pizza or chopped up in a salad. In my mind, there is no good kind of onion, and that is sort of how I feel about cancer. But what I came to understand is that those folks had heard that for most patients who are diagnosed with thyroid cancer, if they get access to the right kind of surgery and treatment, they will survive. So within a couple of days, I had what they call a complete neck dissection. They took my thyroid gland and about 100 cancer-impacted lymph nodes from my neck. But they couldn't get all of the cancerous thyroid tissue out of my body because it's sort of woven into your existing tissue bed. So to treat that, you take a radioactive iodine pill, and then the radioactivity in the iodine kills the cancerous tissue. Unfortunately, that pill is so radioactive that you too become radioactive. You become so radioactive that after you take the pill, you can have no human contact for 2 weeks. So I would take a radioactive iodine pill, and within 1 hour, I had to be locked in my home and could have no human contact for 14 days. What I learned through radioactive iodine treatment, and the rest of the world learned 5 years later through COVID, is that the novelty of social distancing and isolation and quarantine sort of wears off after the first couple days. In fact, my daughter was 7 at the time of my initial diagnosis. So after I'd take a radioactive iodine pill, I couldn't be in the same room as her. We couldn't breathe the same air. I certainly couldn't wrap her up in a hug. And we went through that same cycle of recurrence and surgery and radioactive iodine treatment and total isolation 3 times in 2015 and 2016. But about the middle of 2016, a scan of my body showed no new cancer. I had survived thyroid cancer. And to be honest, over the next couple of months and years, I sort of returned to normalcy. I didn't spend a lot of time worrying about it or thinking about it. I had closed the door on cancer. Unfortunately, in 2019, cancer came knocking again. I had a little lump growing between my shoulder blades. My doctor and I agreed that it was probably just a benign cyst, but given my cancer history, we decided to do a biopsy before a routine outpatient procedure to remove that lump. And on the night before I was supposed to go in for that routine outpatient procedure, my doctor called to share the news that my biopsy had indicated that that was not a benign cyst. It was a malignant tumor. I had a relatively rare form of cancer. It was rare enough that they didn't treat it anywhere in South Dakota, and I was immediately referred to Mayo Clinic. Within a couple of days, my family and I were gathered in Rochester, meeting with oncologists and surgeons and radiologists, once again devising a plan to rid my body of cancer. I had what was known as a deep nerve tissue sarcoma, and it grew as a tumor right in the middle of my chest. And it took long enough to grow there and get to the surface that in the meantime, it had fused to my lungs and to my spine and to my rib cage. I spent the rest of the spring and most of the summer of 2019 living just a couple blocks from Mayo Clinic, receiving daily proton beam radiation treatment, preparing for a massive surgery in late July. The surgery was so massive because to get the tumor out of my chest, they also had to break and take one of my ribs, they had to take a nerve from my spine, they had to take a chunk of my lungs. It sounds like both an exaggeration and an understatement to say now that the days and weeks following that surgery in July of 2019 were the worst of my life. But I was surrounded by love and support from my family. Amelia and I watched every episode of all 10 seasons of Friends from my recovery bed. And toward the end of 2019, I rejoined a growing cohort of cancer survivors. Now, I use the word growing very intentionally. The year I was born, there were about 3 million cancer survivors in America. 40 years later, that number topped 18 million cancer survivors, and it's projected that about a decade from now, the number will be more than 22.5 million cancer survivors in our country. Diagnoses are coming earlier, and that process is getting better. The process of treatment is improving. More and more people can and will survive cancer. But I want to share another salient statistic with you all. 3 out of 4, 75% of cancer survivors will struggle with persistent mental health challenges throughout the rest of their lives. Now, I want to pause and preface the rest of our conversation by acknowledging how lucky I am. I've lost people I love dearly to cancer. I would venture to guess that every person in this room has been impacted by cancer in one way or another. I know the great good fortune I have to have survived cancer twice, to watch my daughter grow up, to be standing on this stage tonight. But I also know the fear and the anger and the anxiety and the guilt and the depression that comes in survivorship. When it feels like your body is finally healing, but your mind is breaking a little. It's a fear that the cancer is going to come back. It's anger about all of the hardship that cancer has brought into your life. It's anxiety about the very real and very heavy financial burden of surviving cancer in America. It's guilt because of the burden you've also brought into the lives of your loved ones. And guilt because you don't feel as celebratory as you thought you would, or perhaps as celebratory as the world around you thinks you should. I mean, you're one of the lucky ones. You survived. But survival is complicated. In fact, the reality of surviving cancer can make celebrating survival sort of challenging. But I've learned some valuable lessons on the way to surviving cancer twice, and I've taken good notes. And tonight I want to share just a couple of do's and don'ts with you all. The first don't I would share with you is don't compare calamities. I think so much of our lives is spent in the tension, in the overlap of endurance and enjoyment, and enduring really tough stuff and enjoying really beautiful things. And I think sort of our natural tendency is to compare our experience to that of another. When you get so caught up in comparing your journey to somebody else's, you sort of sort of lose the depth of your own experience and diminish theirs as well. Just don't get caught up in comparing calamities, but do practice gratitude. So I have a little notebook and a Sharpie that I keep on my nightstand. I don't write in a diary. This is like a very non-diary notebook. It's the kind of notebook where I write things that happen every day and things I want to remember, and sometimes I'll jot down to-do lists. In fact, the slides that you see here are mostly just like doodles and little charts and ideas that I scanned in directly from that very non-diary notebook and from note cards that I keep tucked between the pages. And on the bottom of most of those pages, I will jot down a handful of things I'm really thankful for. Big things and small things. A meal I really enjoyed, a book that I'm reading, memories from a trip we took. But that list is a reminder to me that there is always, always, always something to be grateful for. Something else that I jot down on the pages of that very non-diary notebook is what I call the Bart Simpson exercise. So this comes from the opening sequence of the TV show The Simpsons, when Bart is standing at that chalkboard with his teacher looming over his shoulder, and as a form of punishment, he's writing the same line over and over and over again. Almost every day of my adult life, I've run about 3 miles. It's really good for my physical well-being. I think it's probably better for my mental health. But in the summer and fall of 2019, when I needed it the most, I couldn't walk around the block, let alone run 3 miles. So I sort of did the only thing I knew I could do, which was put pen to paper. And like Bart Simpson standing at the chalkboard, I just started to write, I will run 3 miles again. I will run 3 miles again. I will run 3 miles again. Seeing it in black and white was almost the only way that I could manifest it, transitioning from what I hoped and wished would happen into what I knew would happen. And eventually I did run 3 miles again. Speaking of pop culture icons from the early 90s, the next do I would share with you is do your best, Kevin McAllister. So this comes from that Christmas movie, Home Alone. The part of the movie where Harry and Marv have chased Kevin into the nativity scene in front of the church. He is hiding among the wise men and the shepherds, but he knows the wet bandits are onto him, that he's home alone and that they're going to come back to his house and break in that night. So as the bandits drive away in their blue van, Kevin trudges down the sidewalk in his snow boots, and through a voiceover, he says, when those guys come back, I'll be ready. Listen, I got cancer twice before I turned 40. There is a pretty high likelihood that my path and cancer's will cross again someday. There's almost nothing I can do to stop that. But I work as hard as I can to stay as mentally strong as possible and to keep my body as physically strong as possible so that I am prepared to withstand another round of surgery and treatment and recovery. If cancer comes back, I'll be ready. The last don't I would share with you is both literal and figurative for me. Don't ignore your scars. I had mentioned a pretty invasive surgery to remove that tumor from my chest, and it left a pretty gnarly scar from kind of right between my shoulder blades to the very base of my spine. Probably the first year after that procedure, I could not look at it. For me, it was just a sign of all of the bad things cancer had brought into my life and all of the good things I thought cancer had taken out of my life. But over time, I sort of forced myself to look at it, to stare it down, to shift the narrative in my own mind. And now I can look at that scar. In fact, I sort of like to look at that scar. It is a reminder of resilience. It is a sign of survival. Whether your scar is literal or figurative, whether yours is like right over your shoulder like mine is, or it just feels like it's on your back, look at it. Don't ignore your scars. Remind yourself of your resilience. And the last do I would share with you is do share your story. There is a statewide leadership development program that comes through Brookings, where I live, every fall. And typically when they're coming to town, I get an opportunity to visit with the class. And in the fall of 2019, the program directors reached out and asked if I would give them a presentation when they were in Brookings. I was still in the midst of recovery, but I had decided it would be a good idea to have that milestone on my calendar. But as the day got closer, I was having a really hard time articulating what felt like an authentic message. I mean, typically I would provide a general and frankly pretty generic message about leadership development or getting involved in your community, and it just wasn't ringing as genuine for me. So on the day I was set to present to that class, I texted the program directors, and I said, I'm going to show up tonight, but I'm wondering if you'll let me share a different message. And they quickly wrote back, we trust you. Just come share what's on your heart and in your mind. So that evening, I walked into a room of 50 or so emerging leaders, and I pulled up a stool. I wasn't yet strong enough to stand in front of them and speak for 20 minutes. And I sat down, and through a shaky voice, I just started to share my story. The story of surviving cancer a couple of times, but perhaps more importantly, something that had completely surprised me about the journey, and that was the impact that survivorship had had on my mental health. And that I thought it was fairly important that I give voice to this experience as a relatively healthy, relatively young male, living in the upper Midwest where it can be hard to talk about or access mental health resources, even in the best of times. Now, thankfully, I was met by a very warm and very gracious audience that evening. But I got to be honest, I left that room on sort of wobbly legs. And I spent the next couple of days wondering if I had been a bit too honest and a bit too vulnerable. And then on Monday morning, I got an email in my inbox, and the author wrote that she had been in the room that night. She sort of thought she had been there for a reason, because she led cancer research for one of our state's largest health systems. And she wondered if I would come share my experience with she and a group of her colleagues. So I sat down and visited with them. And then I got an opportunity to tell that story to a larger group of her colleagues, cancer researchers and oncologists and care providers and clinicians from throughout the state, throughout their system, throughout the region. And that got me in touch with the American Cancer Society. And I got an opportunity to tell my story and the story of survivorship at their events and their fundraisers. Today, I'm one of just a handful of national stakeholders with the American Cancer Society. Multiple times every year, I get an opportunity to sit at a table with the most brilliant cancer researchers on the planet and provide a survivor voice and a survivor perspective as we decide how to award millions of dollars in grant funding to support cancer research and survivorship. All because through a shaky voice and on wobbly legs, I started to tell my story. Your story does not have to include a cancer diagnosis. In fact, man, I really hope it doesn't include two. But when some proverbial heavy metal bucket falls out of the clear blue sky and hits you in the back of the head, which one inevitably will, I hope that you can withstand the blow and then eventually step back and enjoy the brightly colored confetti that just might have come down with it.